November 21st, 1939. A British destroyer explodes in the Thames Estuary, just off the English coast. No torpedo, no submarine, no warning. 3 days later, another ship, same location, same mysterious explosion. Then another, and another. Ships were blowing up in waters the Royal Navy had declared completely safe. And nobody, not the admiral, not the captains, not the most experienced sailors, had any idea what was killing them. By December 1939, over a dozen ships had been destroyed in British home waters, and the panic was spreading fast. Captains who'd faced German U-boats in the Atlantic without flinching were now terrified to enter their own ports. Because at least with a U-boat, you know what you're fighting. You can zigzag, deploy escorts, drop depth charges. But this was like fighting a ghost. Ships were simply sailing along, going about their business, and then suddenly ceasing to exist in a fountain of water and twisted metal. The answer, when it finally came, would be stranger than anyone imagined, and the solution even stranger. March 1940. Britain is being strangled, not by bombs falling on London, not by tanks rolling through Europe, but by something far worse. The silent disappearance of ships in the cold, dark waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Every week, another convoy sets out from North American ports, loaded with food, fuel, medicine, raw materials, everything Britain needs to survive. And every week, fewer ships make it back. The numbers are terrifying. In just the first 4 months of 1940, German U-boats send over 250 Allied ships to the bottom of the Atlantic. That's not just statistics on a naval chart. That's thousands of tons of food that will never reach British tables, fuel that will never power British factories, and sailors who will never see home again. Britain imports roughly 55 million tons of supplies every year just to survive. The island nation produces only about 30% of its own food. Without those convoys, the country faces starvation within months. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, knows exactly what he's doing. He's perfected the wolf pack tactic, groups of submarines hunting together, coordinating their attacks, overwhelming convoy escorts. His U-boats don't fight fair. They strike at night, surfacing to attack in darkness where British sonar can't detect them. A single torpedo can sink a 10,000-ton freighter in minutes. The crew, if they're lucky, might have time to abandon ship before the freezing Atlantic water claims them. Winston Churchill, who becomes Prime Minister in May 1940, will later write that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war. Think about that for a moment. This is a man facing Nazi invasion, the Blitz, the fall of France. And what keeps him up at night? The silent hunters prowling beneath the waves. By spring 1940, Britain's merchant fleet is dying faster than shipyards can replace it. The Royal Navy is stretched impossibly thin, trying to escort convoys, hunt submarines, and defend the homeland simultaneously. Destroyer captains are running their ships into the ground, racing from one convoy to the next. Never enough escorts to go around. Some convoys cross with only 1 or 2 warships, protecting 30 or 40 merchant vessels. But the wolf packs aren't even the worst of Britain's problems, because while Churchill and his admirals are focused on the U-boat threat, Another killer is lurking in the waters. One that doesn't hunt in packs, doesn't need a crew, and strikes without warning, in places where ships should be completely safe. November 21st, 1939. The British destroyer HMS Gipsy is steaming through the Thames Estuary, just off the English coast. This isn't enemy waters. This is practically Britain's front yard, a channel the Royal Navy has swept for mines dozens of times. Then, without warning, a massive explosion tears through the ship's hull. Gipsy goes down in minutes. No torpedo wake, no periscope sighting, no warning whatsoever. 3 days later, it happens again. The merchant ship SS Teruki Maru explodes in the same area. Then another, and another. Ships are blowing up in harbors, river mouths, and coastal waters that should be completely safe. The explosions are catastrophic. Entire bows ripped off, ships broken in half, crews killed instantly. By early December 1939, over a dozen vessels have been lost in British home waters, and nobody has a clue what's causing it. The Admiralty is baffled. These aren't torpedo attacks. There's no evidence of submarine activity in these shallow, heavily patrolled areas. These aren't traditional contact mines either. British minesweepers have combed these routes repeatedly and found nothing. Ships are simply sailing along and then suddenly ceasing to exist. Panic starts creeping into British shipping. Captains who faced U-boats in the Atlantic without flinching are now terrified to enter their own ports. Crews start calling the Thames Estuary the death trap. Some merchant captains flatly refuse to sail through certain channels, even under direct orders. The losses keep mounting through December and into January 1940. The battleship HMS Nelson, 45,000 tons of British naval power, hits something off Scotland and barely limps into port with her bow nearly blown off. If capital ships aren't safe, nothing is. Britain's ports are becoming graveyards, and the Royal Navy doesn't even know what's killing the ships. Then comes the break. November 23, 1939, just 2 days after HMS Gipsy went down, a German aircraft is spotted dropping something by parachute near the mudflats near Shoeburyness at low tide. When the tide goes out, British bomb disposal experts cautiously approach. What they find changes everything. It's a mine, but unlike anything the Royal Navy has seen before. No contact horns, no visible detonation mechanism. It's just sitting there in the mud, looking almost harmless. Lieutenant Commander John Overy and his team spend hours carefully examining it, knowing one wrong move could vaporize them and the answer to Britain's mystery. They work with freezing water lapping at their feet as the tide comes back in, racing against time. What they discover inside sends shockwaves through the Admiralty. This mine doesn't wait for a ship to bump into it. It doesn't need any physical contact at all. Inside the casing is something far more sinister, a magnetic sensor that detects the metal hull of passing ships. When a vessel sails overhead, the mine, quote, feels the magnetic field of all that steel and iron, then detonates. The Germans have weaponized physics itself. Suddenly, everything makes horrible sense. The shallow water attacks, the harbor explosions, the minesweepers sailing right over the weapons without triggering them. Britain isn't just fighting submarines anymore. It's fighting an invisible enemy that turns every ship's own metal hull into a death sentence. The captured magnetic mine lands on the desk of a man who has no business being in the Royal Navy at all. Charles Goodeve is a Canadian chemistry professor who came to Britain on an academic fellowship before the war. He's not a military man. He's not a naval architect. He's a scientist who got swept up in Britain's desperate scramble to mobilize every available brain against the Nazi threat. In late 1939, the Admiralty creates something called the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, basically a dumping ground for unconventional ideas and the odd people who come up with them. Goodeve fits right in. When the magnetic mine problem reaches his office in early 1940, most naval officers are thinking in traditional terms. Build better minesweepers, develop stronger hull plating, map the minefields more carefully. These are sensible, logical approaches from experienced seamen. Goodeve looks at the problem completely differently. He understands something the admirals don't. This isn't a naval problem. It's a physics problem. The mine doesn't care about armor thickness or ship design. It's responding to magnetic fields. Every ship is essentially a giant magnet floating through the water. Steel hulls become magnetized during construction. The hammering, the welding, the shaping of metal all align the iron molecules in Earth's magnetic field. Even after a ship launches, it carries this magnetic signature. And that signature is what's killing crews. Goodeve's solution sounds absolutely insane when he first proposes it. He wants to wrap entire ships in electrical cable and run current through them. Thousands of feet of wire coiled around hulls, powered by onboard generators, creating an electromagnetic field that would cancel out the ship's natural magnetism. He wants to make ships magnetically invisible. The initial reaction from the Admiralty is about what you'd expect. Senior naval officers who spent 30 years at sea are being told by a university professor that they need to turn their warships into floating electromagnets. Some think he's joking. Others think he's wasted their time. One admiral reportedly asks if Goodeve has been drinking. But Goodeve has the math to back it up. He explains that every magnetic field has polarity, north and south. The ship's hull creates one field, and if you generate an equal and opposite field around it, the two cancel each other out. It's the same principle as noise-canceling headphones, except instead of sound waves, you're canceling magnetic fields. To the mind sensors, the ship simply wouldn't exist. It would sail right over the weapon, and the magnetic trigger would never activate. There's just one tiny problem. Nobody has ever tried this on anything bigger than a rowboat. Goodeve is proposing to degauss, that's the technical term, named after the unit of magnetic field strength, every single vessel in the British fleet. Battleships, destroyers, cargo ships, tankers, trawlers, thousands upon thousands of vessels, each one requiring custom calculations, precise wire placement, and careful calibration. The logistics are staggering, and Britain doesn't have time. Ships are exploding daily. The magnetic mines are spreading to every major shipping channel around the British Isles. U-boats are already sinking merchant vessels in open water. Now ships can't even reach port safely. If the Royal Navy spends months testing and debating Goodeve's idea, there might not be a fleet left to save. So, despite the skepticism, despite the astronomical scale of the task, despite the fact that it sounds like something out of a science fiction novel, the Admiralty gives Goodeve permission to try. They don't have better options. Sometimes in war, you have to bet everything on the crazy idea. The first test happens in January 1940 at HMS Vernon, the Royal Navy's torpedo and mining school in Portsmouth. Goodeve and his team select a small minesweeper, HMS Board, as their guinea pig. They spend 3 days measuring the ship's magnetic field from every angle, using sensitive magnetometers borrowed from university physics departments. Then they wrap 2,000 feet of heavy electrical cable around the hull in a carefully calculated pattern, connect it to a generator, and flip the switch. The results are stunning. The ship's magnetic signature drops by over 90%. When they sail HMS Bortisbury over test magnetic sensors, the instruments barely register anything. It's as if the ship has vanished from the magnetic spectrum. Goodeve's crazy idea actually works. But success creates its own nightmare. One test ship is a proof of concept. Britain operates over 9,000 merchant vessels, plus hundreds of Royal Navy warships, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, and countless auxiliary craft. Every single one needs degaussing if they're going to survive passage through British waters. And ships keep arriving daily. American freighters, Canadian escorts, requisitioned trawlers, emergency-built cargo vessels. The queue never stops growing. Goodeve does the math, and it's terrifying. Each ship requires approximately 2,000 feet of thick copper cable. That's over 18 million feet of cable for the merchant fleet alone, enough to wrap around the Earth's equator. Britain's copper supplies are already strained, supporting electrical infrastructure, munitions production, and aircraft manufacturing. Now Goodeve needs an entire additional supply chain just for degaussing cable. Then there's the installation problem. You can't just hire any electrician off the street for this work. The cable placement must be precise. Wrong positioning and the degaussing field won't properly cancel the hull's magnetism. Too much current and you risk starting fires or damaging electrical systems. Too little and the ship remains vulnerable. Each installation requires trained personnel who understand both electrical engineering and naval architecture. Britain doesn't have those people. The country is fighting a war on multiple fronts. Every qualified engineer is already working 16-hour days on radar, aircraft engines, gun systems, or code breaking. Goodeve needs to create an entire workforce, train them in weeks, and deploy them to shipyards across Britain and eventually Allied ports worldwide. The Admiralty establishes degaussing stations at major ports: Portsmouth, Liverpool, Glasgow, Belfast, and Cardiff. Each station gets magnetometer equipment, cable supplies, and hastily trained technical crews. Ships arriving in port are immediately measured. Calculations are made. Cable is wound around hulls. Generators are installed. The whole process takes about 48 hours per ship, if everything goes perfectly. It never goes perfectly. Ships arrive damaged from attacks, requiring repairs before degaussing can even start. Cable shipments get delayed. Generators malfunction. Workers make measurement errors and have to start over. And through all of this, U-boats are still hunting outside the harbors, waiting for degaussed ships to emerge and join convoys heading into the Atlantic. Goodeve realizes he needs a faster solution for the massive backlog of vessels. His team develops a simplified system called wiping. Ships steam slowly past a shoreline installation where massive electromagnets temporarily neutralize their magnetic fields. It's not permanent like proper degaussing, but it lasts for several weeks. Wiping stations go up at harbor entrances, processing multiple ships per day instead of one every 2 days. By March 1940, Britain is degaussing ships faster than Germany can lay magnetic mines. But it's a desperate race against time. Speed becomes everything. Goodeve's operation transforms from a small experimental program into the largest crash engineering project in British history. By April 1940, degaussing stations are operating around the clock, 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Sparks fly from welding torches at midnight. Exhausted electricians measure magnetic fields at dawn. Cable crews work through air raids, ignoring sirens. Because every hour a ship sits waiting for degaussing is an hour it can't carry desperately needed supplies. The Admiralty pulls workers from anywhere they can find them. Retired electricians are called back into service. University physics students are drafted straight from lecture halls. Women join degaussing crews in unprecedented numbers, operating magnetometers and calculating cable patterns. Work that requires precision and mathematical skill, not physical strength. By summer 1940, over 3,000 people are working in degaussing operations across Britain. The logistics are mind-bending. Cable arrives by the ton at ports, wound on massive reels. Workers develop specialized techniques for handling the heavy copper wire. It's thick as a man's thumb and weighs several pounds per foot. Getting it around a ship's hull means lowering crews on scaffolding along the vessel's sides, securing the cable with brackets every few feet, making sure connections are waterproof and won't corrode in seawater. On a large freighter, the installation takes a full day of grueling physical labor. Then there's the testing. After installation, every ship must be measured again to verify the degaussing works. Ships steam slowly through designated testing areas while shore-based magnetometers record their signatures. If the readings are still too high, crews go back and adjust the current, reposition cables, troubleshoot the system. Some vessels require 3 or 4 attempts before they're properly neutralized. The program expands beyond British shores. Canada establishes degaussing stations in Halifax and Montreal. American ports, technically neutral until December 1941, quietly set up degaussing facilities for ships that will join British convoys. Gibraltar, Alexandria, Cape Town, Bombay. Anywhere Allied shipping concentrates, degaussing equipment follows. Goodeve's team writes training manuals, ships equipment overseas, and trains foreign crews in the techniques. But ships keep dying. June 1940 brings catastrophe on multiple fronts. France falls to Germany, giving U-boats access to Atlantic ports like Brest and Lorient, cutting 450 miles off their hunting range. Suddenly, German submarines can stay on patrol much longer, hitting convoys farther from British shores. And while thousands of ships now have degaussing protection against magnetic mines, they're still vulnerable to torpedoes in open water. The Admiralty faces brutal triage decisions. Prioritize warships for degaussing or merchant vessels? New ships just launched or older vessels with years of service? Fast ships that can potentially outrun U-boats or slow cargo haulers carrying the most tonnage? Every choice means some ships will wait longer, remain vulnerable longer, face higher risk. Goodeve's crews work through the Blitz. London's docks burn from German bombing raids, but degaussing continues. Glasgow takes devastating hits in May 1941. Over 2,000 civilians killed, the port infrastructure battered, but the degaussing station keeps operating. Glasgow, Belfast, Cardiff all endure air raids while cable crews keep wrapping ships. By the end of 1940, Britain has degaussed over 4,000 vessels. By mid-1941, that number exceeds 10,000. It's an engineering achievement that rivals building the ships themselves, except it's being done under wartime conditions, with limited resources, constant enemy action, and the knowledge that every delay costs lives at sea. The numbers tell the story better than words ever could. In the first 3 months of 1940, before degaussing became widespread, magnetic mines sink or damage 115 British ships in home waters. By late 1940, after thousands of vessels received degaussing protection, that number drops to fewer than 20 ships for the same 3-month period. By 1941, magnetic mine losses become almost negligible, less than a dozen vessels for the entire year. Goodeve's crazy idea has essentially neutralized Germany's wonder weapon. Charles Goodeve never becomes a household name. No monuments are built to honor him. No Hollywood films dramatize his achievement. While codebreakers at Bletchley Park and radar scientists get post-war recognition, the man who saved thousands of ships and tens of thousands of lives remains largely unknown outside naval engineering circles. That's often how war works. The most crucial innovations happen quietly, solved by people nobody's heard of, while headlines focus on battles and generals. But the impact of his work extends far beyond World War II. Degaussing becomes permanent naval doctrine for every major navy worldwide. Modern warships still use degaussing systems, though they've evolved into sophisticated computer-controlled installations that continuously adjust to changing magnetic conditions. Submarines, which must avoid detection by magnetic anomaly detectors, use even more advanced degaussing technology. The same principles protect undersea cables, scientific instruments, and sensitive electronics from magnetic interference. Goodeve's broader legacy lies in how he approached the problem. He didn't think like a naval officer bound by tradition and conventional tactics. He thought like a scientist who understood that modern warfare increasingly meant fighting physics itself. Radar was turning air combat into an electromagnetic chess game. Sonar was making submarine warfare a battle of sound waves. And magnetic mines had weaponized Earth's own magnetic field. Victory would go to whoever best understood and exploited scientific principles. The Royal Navy recognized this shift. the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development evolved into a permanent institution. Britain established closer ties between universities and military research. Scientists stopped being treated as eccentric outsiders and became integral to defense planning. Goodeve himself rose to become Director of Naval Land Equipment, then Controller of Research and Development for the Ministry of Supply. After the war, he received a knighthood and continued working on scientific problems until his death in 1980. But perhaps the most important lesson from the degaussing story is about institutional flexibility under pressure. The Royal Navy in 1940 was one of history's most tradition-bound organizations. Hundreds of years of customs, protocols, and established procedures. Yet when faced with an existential threat, when ships were exploding and conventional solutions weren't working, the Admiralty gave a university professor with a wild idea the authority to rewire their entire fleet. That kind of institutional courage is rare. Think about what Britain accomplished in less than 2 years. They took a theoretical concept, proved it worked, scaled it to thousands of ships, trained thousands of workers, established global infrastructure, and essentially solved a problem that threatened to starve the nation into surrender, all while fighting a war on multiple fronts, enduring bombing raids, facing possible invasion, and operating under conditions of absolute desperation. The convoys kept sailing. Britain survived. And though degaussing was just one factor among many, convoy tactics, escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, code breaking, and sheer courage all played crucial roles. It eliminated one deadly threat at precisely the moment when Britain couldn't afford any more losses. Sometimes in war, the craziest idea turns out to be the right one. Sometimes wrapping ships in miles of electrical cable and turning them into electromagnets is exactly what saves a nation. And sometimes the hero isn't the admiral on the bridge or the pilot in the cockpit. It's a Canadian chemistry professor who understood magnetism better than anyone thought possible.